The man I loved for more than half my life was lying in a casket 10 feet away, and yet it was my son who delivered the final blow. He turned to a room full of grieving strangers and called me a liar. A thief. A woman who had taken advantage of his dying father. No one stood up for me. Not even the sister-in-law who used to kiss my cheeks on Christmas morning. I stood in silence, letting the shame fall over me like a second skin. But grief has its own timing. And so does truth, because just as Jason sat back down, the doors creaked open, and with them came everything they didn't expect to hear. The rain hadn't let up since dawn. It tapped against the chapel windows like tiny accusations, steady and relentless. I stood in the back behind the last row of pews, half hidden behind a marble column, the hem of my black dress soaked from the puddles outside. My hands clutched the strap of my purse, knuckles white. No one had acknowledged me since I arrived. The pews were packed. Men in tailored suits, women in modest dresses, everyone in their best grief. Floral arrangements surrounded the polished oak casket at the front of the room, lilies and white roses overflowing onto the carpet. Richard had hated lilies. They reminded him of hospitals, but his sister Marion must have chosen them. She handled everything. The service, the guest list, even the obituary. I hadn't been asked to do a thing. Jason sat in the front row, shoulders square, jaw set like stone. Claire, his wife, sat next to him, her hand resting on Abigail's tiny wrist. My granddaughter's hair was braided neatly down her back the way I used to do it. She didn't look at me. Neither did Claire. It was like I didn't exist. I shifted my weight from one foot to the other. No one offered me a seat. Not that I expected one. Richard and I were married for 41 years. And now in the room meant to honor his life, I was nothing more than a tolerated presence. The pastor said a few words about legacy and faith and loss. People nodded solemnly. Then Jason stood and walked to the podium. He adjusted the microphone with the same nervous twitch Richard used to have, tapping it once before clearing his throat. My son was 35 with his father's height, and my eyes, though, in recent years, he'd used them mostly to look past me. He placed a folded piece of paper on the podium, but he didn't look at it. His voice was steady, low. My father, he said, was a man of integrity. He built Thompson and Hart from the ground up. He took care of his employees, never cut corners, never compromised his principles. He was the kind of man people looked up to. Heads nodded in agreement, murmurs of approval. He deserved better in his final months. My breath caught. I knew what was coming. I had seen it in his silence these past months, in the way he refused to return my calls, in the sharp, clipped tone of his emails, if he replied at all. Jason's eyes scanned the room and then landed on me. I felt it like a punch to the chest. He didn't blink. He trusted the people around him. But sometimes trust is misplaced. I swallowed hard, heart-pounding. The woman standing at the back of this room. The one who says she was his partner, who claims she supported him through his battle with cancer. She betrayed him. A ripple ran through the room. Someone in the third row shifted in their seat. She stole from him. From a man who was dying. She falsified documents. She took advantage of his condition. She manipulated him in the end when he wasn't thinking clearly. Every word slammed into me. My face burned, but I couldn't move. I stood frozen, my heels pressed into the carpet like anchors. Jason kept going, his voice louder now. She convinced him to change his will. She made herself the sole beneficiary of decisions he never would have made in his right mind. She robbed him while he was slipping away. Claire reached for Jason's hand as if to ground him. Abigail stared down at her shoes. I wanted to speak, to interrupt, to say that none of it was true. That Richard knew exactly what he was doing, that he had asked for my help when the tremors in his hands made it impossible to sign checks or approve invoices, that everything I did for him, for us, but my throat wouldn't open. My son, the boy I had nursed through fevers and cheered for at soccer games, was dismantling me in front of a room full of people who had already decided I didn't belong here. "She is not who you think she is," Jason said, "and she was not who he thought she was." Silence followed, deep and cold. No one turned to look at me. They didn't need to. I felt their judgment like a tide rising over my shoes. Jason folded his note in half and placed it in his jacket pocket. He stepped down from the podium and returned to his seat. Claire leaned into him, whispered something I couldn't hear. I stood in the back of the chapel, unable to breathe, unable to cry. There were no words left in me. I had been erased. Not just from Richard's death, but from his life. Jason folded his note in half and placed it in his jacket pocket. He stepped down from the podium and returned to his seat. Claire leaned into him, whispered something I couldn't hear. I stood in the back of the chapel, unable to breathe, unable to cry. There were no words left in me. I had been erased. Not just from Richard's death, but from his life. Someone cleared their throat. A chair creaked. For a moment I thought maybe someone would say something push-back object, but no one did. The silence in that chapel settled like dust, heavy, still suffocating. Then Marion stood. She didn't walk to the podium. She didn't need to. Her voice carried sharp and certain. She said she was his wife. She claimed she was his partner, but Richard was never himself in those final months, and she took full advantage of that. I could barely process the words, but each one cut deeper than the last. She never belonged in this family. She was a housekeeper's daughter, a girl from South Hills pretending to be something she's not. There it was, the thing that had always lingered just beneath the surface finally spoken out loud. I had been married to Richard for over 4 decades, but I had never truly been one of them. I was the girl with a Spanish last name, the one who didn't go to Waverly Prep, who didn't summer in Cape May, who didn't belong in their country clubs or charity boards, and now that he was gone, they no longer had to pretend. Marion's voice softened just enough to feign sympathy. It's not easy losing someone you built your life around. But we have to remember the truth. And the truth is, she took more than his name. She took his control, his legacy. She sat down slowly with that calculated grace she always carried. The kind of poise that reminded everyone she was a Thompson by blood. A few people shifted in their seats as if uncertain whether to applaud or bow their heads. I didn't move. I thought about the first time I met Richard. I had been 20 and working part-time as a receptionist at a small construction supply firm while finishing my associate's degree at Portland Community College. He was 27, newly minted with an MBA from Stanford, and already managing regional projects for Thompson and Hart. He used to bring me coffee from the cafe across the street. He said my eyes reminded him of Sunday mornings. He wasn't like them back then. He didn't care that I took the bus to work, or that my mother cleaned houses in Lake Oswego. He used to tell me that the only opinion that mattered was his. That was before the cancer, before he grew tired, before Marion came around more often, whispering old warnings into his ear. I remembered the night I found him sitting at the kitchen table, hands shaking as he tried to sign a vendor contract. He looked up at me and said, "I can't do this anymore. Can you help me?" And I did. I signed it, with his blessing, with his full awareness. That was the beginning. Invoices, payroll, health insurance extensions. I kept the wheels turning because he asked me to. But now that story was being rewritten, and no one in this room wanted to hear my version. A man I recognized from the accounting firm shifted uncomfortably in the 3rd row. He had shared bourbon with Richard every 4th of July for years, but today he avoided my gaze. Beside him, his wife clutched her purse a little tighter. Even the pastor looked like he wanted the floor to open beneath him. I turned slowly, hoping maybe one person might look at me with something other than judgment. But they didn't. Even the people I'd hosted in my home, the ones who had complimented my cooking at every holiday, the ones I had sent Christmas cards to for years, sat with stiff shoulders and averted eyes. In their silence, they'd chosen a side. My knees trembled. I gripped the back of the pew nearest to me, steadying myself. My breath came in shallow bursts. The grief I had been holding for weeks started to slip sideways, transforming into something harder, something heavier. I thought about the last few months, about Richard's decline, about the days he could barely hold a fork, about how I'd sat beside him every morning reading out his emails, helping him respond, watching as his fingers struggled to press the keys. He never once asked me to stop. Not once. And now those same emails, those signed checks, those hospital room conversations were being twisted into a narrative I didn't recognize. Jason had always looked up to his father. I understood that. I admired that. But somewhere along the way, his grief had turned into something else. Something fueled by someone else's bitterness. Marian. She had never forgiven Richard for choosing me. And now she was rewriting the ending to make sense of it. I didn't cry. Not because I wasn't hurt. I was. But I had long since learned the cost of crying in front of people who saw it as weakness. So I stood there, chin lifted just enough to keep my dignity intact and let them say what they needed to say. They could have the floor, the podium, the silence of cowards. But they couldn't erase what I knew to be true. I had been his wife. I had been his caretaker. I had been his partner, and despite everything they were saying now, I knew. Deep down, I knew. He had trusted me until the very end. I kept my eyes fixed on the stained glass window above the altar, watching the light move through it as the pastor returned to speak again. I didn't hear his words. I didn't need to. The room had already said everything it came to say. The chapel doors creaked open with an echo that sliced through the pastor's voice mid-sentence. Heads turned. Some shifted in their seats. A gust of colder air swept in as a tall man in a gray suit stepped inside, carrying a slim leather briefcase in one hand and a tablet in the other. I blinked at him, uncertain. He walked with calm certainty, his footsteps clicking against the stone floor. He wasn't anyone I recognized. His presence was too deliberate to be a mourner who arrived late. He didn't glance at the casket, didn't bow his head, didn't pause. He made his way toward the front, stopping just before the first pew. "My name is Henry West," he said clearly. "I'm the estate attorney for Richard Thompson." The pastor looked startled. Jason stood immediately, his face tightening. I watched him exchange a quick look with Marian, who leaned toward him and whispered something sharp and short. Jason stepped into the aisle. "That's not possible. We already handled everything through Parker Law. Dad's accounts, though all of it has been settled." Henry didn't flinch. He simply nodded, calm as ever. "Yes, you worked with Parker Law on standard asset documentation. But 6 months before his passing, Richard retained me for separate matters. Personal matters. And he requested that I appear today should certain things occur." Marian's face drained of color. Jason hesitated, glancing back at Claire. She looked confused, concerned. I felt my chest tighten. Henry continued. "I realize this is unusual, but Mr. Thompson was very specific. If the circumstances matched those he anticipated, I was to make a statement and share a recording in his own words." A murmur rippled through the room. Jason's voice was low but tense. "This is my father's funeral. You can't just show up and start. This isn't the time." Henry remained polite but firm. "Jason, I'm here under legal instruction. Your father understood there might be misunderstandings. He wanted clarity. He wanted his voice heard." Jason didn't answer. Claire tugged lightly at his jacket as if to caution him. Henry turned to the pastor. "If I may have 2 minutes." The pastor, clearly overwhelmed, simply stepped aside. Henry turned back toward the audience, toward me. My heart thudded in my chest, heavy and slow. Henry set the briefcase down, opened the tablet, and tapped the screen. The small screen lit up and a familiar face appeared. Richard. His hair was thinner, skin pale. He looked older than I remembered from those last days, but he was alert, eyes focused on the camera. The timestamp in the corner of the screen showed the recording date 3 weeks before he passed. The chapel went silent. You could have heard a breath drop, "If you're watching this," Richard said, "then I'm gone. And I imagine things have gotten complicated." A few people shifted in their seats again. "I know my family. I love them, but I know them." He paused to take a breath. His voice was hoarse but steady. "They've never accepted Linda. They've tolerated her, but deep down they never believed she belonged. And now that I'm not here, they'll finally feel free to say it." I felt like every cell in my body froze. His eyes on the screen were not looking at anyone else. They were looking straight into mine. "Let me be very clear." His voice sharpened. "Every document Linda signed, every decision she made, every transfer, every contract, every single piece of business she touched, she did because I asked her to. Because I needed her. Because I trusted her." The silence in the room was absolute. Not a cough, not a breath. She didn't manipulate me. She didn't deceive me. She saved me. She saved the company. She kept 48 families employed when I was too proud to admit I couldn't do it anymore. I glanced at Marion. Her eyes were locked on the tablet, jaw clenched so tightly her temple twitched. Jason didn't move. "And if anyone tells you otherwise, if anyone dares to say that Linda married me for money or that she took advantage of my illness, then shame on them." He paused again. His chest rose and fell slowly. "Linda gave me 41 years of her life. She held my hand through everything. And in the end, she carried me further than anyone else could have. You don't get to erase that with a speech." The screen went black. For a full beat, no one spoke. Then Henry stepped back and picked up his tablet. "That's all I was asked to share today. Thank you for your time." He nodded once, then quietly returned to the aisle and walked out of the chapel, briefcase in hand. Jason sat frozen in place. The pastor stepped forward again, but no one was listening. I remained still, not because I didn't want to move, but because I couldn't. My knees felt like they might buckle. My breath came shallow and fast. He had recorded it. He had known. And somehow in that moment, everything inside me stopped aching. Not because the room had changed, not because they believed me, but because Richard had. And that was the only voice I'd needed. I stood there, still holding my breath, as if moving too quickly might shatter whatever fragile shift had just occurred in the room. Richard's face was gone from the screen, but his voice lingered in the silence. It filled every corner of the chapel more powerfully than any hymn or eulogy had that morning. No one looked at me. But no one looked at Marion either. Jason sat stiff, his eyes down, his hands clenched in his lap. Claire leaned forward slightly, whispering something, but he didn't respond. Abigail peeked over her shoulder at me, her young face unsure caught between the world of grown-ups and the one where she still remembered how I made cinnamon toast for her on Saturday mornings. The pastor cleared his throat but didn't speak. For the first time in months, I felt taller. Richard hadn't just defended me. He had named them. He had seen this coming. I had asked him once weeks before he passed why he kept letting Marion meddle, why he didn't shut down the quiet war she had been waging against me since the moment he got sick. He had looked at me with tired eyes and said, "Let them talk. The truth always finds a way." Now it had. I stepped out from behind the column and into the aisle. Slowly, carefully, like someone emerging from wreckage. No one stopped me. No one moved. My heels clicked against the tile as I walked down the center aisle, past people who couldn't meet my eyes. I passed the same men who once clapped Richard on the back and told me I was lucky to have him. Past the women who used to compliment my dinner parties while whispering afterward that my Spanish was too casual for someone living in West Haven Heights. Marion stared ahead, her jaw locked in place, her face pale. Jason didn't look up. As I neared the front, I paused. My eyes found Abigail again. She was watching me. This time she didn't look away. I gave her the smallest nod. She blinked, then lowered her gaze to her lap. I kept walking. I reached the front pew where Jason sat. His shoulders tight, his posture still rigid like he had been carved into place. I stopped beside him and waited until he finally looked up at me. His face wasn't angry. It was something else. Something rawer. Like he didn't know what to say. Like he didn't know how to be this version of himself. I looked at him for a long time, searching for the boy I had once rocked to sleep during thunderstorms, the teenager who used to leave sticky notes on the fridge reminding me to buy his favorite cereal. He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. I took a breath. "I'll be at the house tomorrow morning to collect my things," I said quietly, evenly. He nodded once, eyes shining, lips pressed together. After that, I added, "You won't see me again unless you want to." I didn't wait for a reply. I turned away and walked toward the chapel doors. Behind me, the silence was deeper than before. But it wasn't heavy anymore. It was clean. I stepped outside into the cold afternoon air. The sky had cleared while we were inside. The sun hovered low behind the clouds, casting soft light across the parking lot. My car sat in the far corner, the only one with raindrops still clinging to the windows. I walked slowly, letting each step root me more fully in my body. Richard had spoken. He had trusted me to carry the weight of our life together, and now even in death, he had lifted mine. When I reached the car, I paused and looked back at the chapel. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel vindicated. I just felt done. I opened the door and sat down behind the wheel, closing it gently behind me. The air inside was still. I gripped the steering wheel with both hands and let the quiet settle in. I didn't start the car. I just sat there in the quiet, in the truth, and finally in peace. The next morning I packed in silence. The house felt colder than usual, though I knew it was only my mind marking the shift. The same kitchen where I had made pancakes for Jason every Saturday as a boy, where Richard used to sneak midnight slices of pie, now felt like a museum of someone else's life. Every picture frame, every dish, every drawer held memories that suddenly didn't belong to me anymore. I didn't take much. A few clothes, my paperwork, a worn photo album that somehow survived decades of decluttering, and the gold earrings Richard gave me on our 20th anniversary. I stood in front of the bedroom mirror, fastened them in my ears, and then removed them again. They felt too heavy for where I was going. Jason didn't come downstairs. I heard muffled movement above a door creak, then silence. I didn't need a goodbye. I left a note on the kitchen counter. It said what I had already told him the day before. "I'm leaving this morning. If you ever want to find me again, you know how, but I won't wait for it." I slid the key onto the note and walked out without looking back. The house locked behind me with a soft click, final and clean. Within 48 hours, as Marion had threatened, the estate accounts were frozen. My personal bank account was flagged for review. A clerk from Parker and Langford called to inform me that due to the pending legal dispute over the will, all associated assets were under temporary administrative hold. I didn't argue. I didn't ask questions. I simply thanked her, hung up, and stared at the motel pamphlet I'd picked up from the gas station the night before. The Riverbend Inn was a low-slung building off Route 22 on the edge of Salem, with flickering vacancy signage and a front desk that smelled like burnt coffee and lemon disinfectant. A tired-looking woman named Connie took my ID and barely glanced at me. $75 a night. Cash preferred. I handed her the money from the small envelope I had pulled out of my glove box. The last of what was left. 3 weeks. That was how long I could stay if I didn't eat anything fancy and didn't use the heater too much. That afternoon I sat on the thin motel bed and stared at my suitcase. I took out the gold earrings, laid them in my palm, and closed my fingers around them. The next morning, I walked 2 blocks to a pawn shop near the bus terminal and watched as the man behind the glass evaluated them without saying a word. When he offered me $400, I nodded once. I didn't ask for more. With the cash tucked inside my coat, I walked down the sidewalk, trying not to think about the way Richard had smiled when he clipped those earrings into place behind my ears so many years ago. I didn't have time for memories. I had to find a job. The employment agency in downtown Salem was a beige building with broken blinds and an old water cooler that groaned every 10 minutes. I filled out a form, handed it to a bored-looking receptionist, and waited. My phone rang once during the wait. An unknown number. I let it go to voicemail. A man called me in 20 minutes later. He looked over my resume, raised an eyebrow, then tapped something on his keyboard. "You've worked with Thompson & Hart for nearly 2 decades, he asked. "Yes," I said. He didn't respond right away. "There's a flag on your name," he said finally. "Ongoing civil investigation? Financial misconduct linked to disputed estate documentation." I opened my mouth to explain, but stopped. It wouldn't matter. Not here. He handed the paper back to me. "I'm sorry. We can't place you with any of our office clients." Outside, I sat on the curb next to the parking lot and stared at the gravel. Cars rolled by. The wind picked up. A few minutes later, someone exited the building. A familiar face? Diane Kerrigan. She had once been Richard's accounts manager. We'd worked on quarterly reports together for years. She saw me. Her expression froze. She hesitated, then adjusted her purse and kept walking. She didn't say a word. That night, I circled a job ad in the back of a free paper I found at the laundromat. A small family restaurant on Pine Street needed dishwashers, night shifts, cash paid daily, no questions. The next day, I walked into El Rancho. It was a narrow, warm-smelling place with mismatched chairs and colorful tiles on the counter. Behind the register, a woman with a streak of gray in her dark hair watched me approach. "I'm here about the dishwasher job," I said. "You speak Spanish?" she asked. "Sí," I said. "Claro." She studied me for a long second. "Name, Linda." She nodded. "You ever worked in a kitchen a long time ago?" Her mouth curved slightly. "Good. Bring shoes you don't mind ruining. Come tomorrow, 5 o'clock. Name's Teresa." She turned away before I could say thank you. That night I sat at the motel desk and wrote down my new schedule in the corner of a gas receipt. 5 nights a week. 6 to midnight. My hands were shaking, but not from fear. They were remembering what it meant to start over. By the end of my first week at El Rancho, I had dishwater burns along my wrists, 2 broken nails, and a dull ache running through my lower back that no amount of stretching could fix. The kitchen smelled like wet tortillas and metal. It was loud hot and non-stop from the moment I clocked in. I didn't complain. I didn't talk much at all. The other staff barely noticed me. A few teenage boys from Guatemala cracked jokes in Spanish while spraying pans with the power hose. Teresa moved through the back like a general issuing orders in short bursts, her silver hair pulled back with a pencil. I kept my head down, loaded the racks, rinsed the plates. I moved trays of mugs that rattled like teeth. My hands cracked and bled beneath the rubber gloves. At night, I soaked them in a bowl of warm salt water and wrapped them in paper towels. It was the kind of pain that felt clean, earned. One night after a late Friday shift, I stepped out the back door into the narrow alley behind the restaurant. The dumpsters smelled like bleach and onion skins. I lit a cigarette, though I hadn't smoked in years, and leaned against the brick wall to let the cold settle into my skin. That was when I heard the scuffle. At first I thought it was 2 people arguing, a couple maybe, but then the tone shifted. Sharp, fast, desperate. A girl's voice. "Get off me!" I dropped the cigarette and moved without thinking. My sneakers splashed through the puddle as I rounded the corner. There, beneath the single flickering light above the side lot, a young woman was pressed against the wall, her arm pinned behind her back. A man loomed over her, yelling low and angry, his hand clenched around her wrist. "Hey!" I shouted louder than I meant to. "Let her go!" The man turned his head. He looked maybe 30 tall in a hooded sweatshirt and jeans dark with rain. His face flushed with alcohol and fury. For a second, he didn't move. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my phone, lifting it like I was already dialing. "I'm calling the police." He hesitated. The girl tried to pull away again, and this time he let go with a shove. She stumbled, hit the wall, and slid down to her knees. "This isn't over," he muttered, then turned and disappeared into the darkness of the alley. I waited until I couldn't hear his footsteps anymore, then knelt beside the girl. She was maybe 19, no more than 21. Long, dark hair, cheeks wet with rain or tears or both. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head, but her hands trembled. I helped her to her feet and led her back inside where the kitchen had gone quiet. Teresa looked up when we entered, her eyes narrowing. In the office, I sat the girl down and handed her a towel. She didn't speak for a long while, just held the towel in both hands and stared at the floor. "His name is Derek," she said finally. "My ex. He's been following me since I left. I thought if I didn't answer, he'd give up. He won't." I said, "Not on his own." She looked up then, like she wanted to believe me but didn't know how. We talked until the police arrived. I stayed while she gave her statement, then drove her home myself. She lived in a basement studio across town, barely big enough for a bed and a sink. Before I left, I wrote my number on the back of a takeout receipt. If he shows up again, you call. No hesitation. The next afternoon, I brought her a stack of pamphlets and a small business card with the number for Northwest Justice Center printed in plain black font. "They help women in your situation. They don't judge, and they don't charge." She turned the card over slowly, like it might disappear. "Thank you," she said. "You didn't have to stop." "Yes, I did." She smiled a little. The first time I'd seen her do it. Her name was Natalie Torres, 19. She worked part-time at a hair salon and was saving up to go back to school. Her parents lived in Arizona. She had no car, no protection order, and no family nearby. That week, I drove her to the Justice Center for intake. I sat with her in the waiting room while she filled out forms, helped her write a timeline of the abuse, and took notes while the intake coordinator explained the process. Afterward, we went to a small diner and split a plate of fries. "He told me no one would believe me," Natalie said, dipping one in ketchup. I almost believed it. "They count on that," I said. She looked at me, then said quietly, "You should work at that place. You were better than the lady with the clipboard." I laughed, but the words stayed with me. That night, I pulled out my old laptop from the motel closet and searched the center's website. They had volunteer opportunities, advocate assistant, paperwork prep, client support, no law degree required, just time and willingness to help. I had plenty of both. I filled out the volunteer application that same night and emailed it before I could talk myself out of it. By the end of the week, someone from Northwest Justice Center called me for an intake interview. Her name was Janine, soft-spoken, with a voice that reminded me of public radio. She asked about my experience, my availability, why I wanted to help. I told her about Natalie, about how no one ever tells you that silence is the first language of fear, that sometimes all someone needs is for another person to sit beside them and not look away. She paused, then said they could use me at the front desk 2 afternoons a week. Training would be provided. I accepted immediately. I started with scanning intake packets, organizing resources by language and county. I watched other volunteers assist women who barely spoke English, who held thick manila folders filled with eviction notices, restraining orders, and unpaid medical bills. I watched how carefully they were guided, how often they left crying not from sadness, but from relief. One day, a woman who had come in with her elderly mother needed help filling out a power of attorney form. The front desk was swamped. Janine waved me over. "Linda, can you sit with them and help get this started?" I nodded, took a deep breath and walked over. The form was long. The questions were worded in legal terms designed to intimidate. But I took my time, translated gently, asked follow-ups when needed. The woman looked at me halfway through and whispered, "You're good at this." I stayed late that day. I stayed late most days after that. A month later, I saw a flyer on the bulletin board for a night program at Willamette Community College, a paralegal certificate, evening classes part-time, 8 months to completion. The tuition wasn't cheap, but they offered a payment plan. I used the pawn money and a small refund check I hadn't expected from an old insurance policy. On the first day of class, I sat in the back corner of the room feeling 10 years older than anyone there. But as more people trickled in, I realized something. Most of them looked like me. Women in their 40s, 50s, 60s, a few men. A few who clearly had been through the system themselves. Not everyone was chasing a new career. Some just wanted to understand the rules that had once been used against them. Our instructor introduced herself as Diane Torres. She had been a prosecutor in Eugene for 20 years before switching to victim advocacy. She didn't smile much, but her voice was steady and clear. She said that knowing the law was important, but knowing how to listen was more important. Sometimes she told us sitting beside someone at the right moment means more than all the legal knowledge in the world. I wrote that down. Underlined it. During the days I still worked the kitchen shifts at El Rancho. Teresa let me switch a few nights for afternoon classes. She never asked questions. Just nodded and said, "Bring home extra rolls if you want." At the Justice Center, I began helping with immigration paperwork, housing complaints, Medicare disputes. Some of the cases were heartbreaking. Some were infuriating. Many were both. Not everyone welcomed me. One of the longtime volunteers, a woman named Carol, barely spoke to me for weeks. She had been there for over 10 years, and I could tell she thought I didn't belong. Maybe she had read the headlines about Richard's estate. Maybe she had heard Marion's version of the story. Maybe she just didn't like that someone new was stepping into her space. She made passive comments in meetings, corrected me in front of clients, double-checked everything I filed. I didn't fight it. I just kept showing up. Then one Thursday afternoon, a new client came in. An elderly woman named Jean, barely 5 feet tall with a large floral purse and trembling hands. Her grandson had convinced her to sign a power of attorney document after her husband died. Over the course of a year, he drained her savings, sold her car, and refinanced her house without her knowledge. Jean didn't understand most of the documents she signed. She only knew she no longer had access to her own money. The legal team didn't want to take the case. It was messy. No clear paper trail. No immediate resolution. But I saw something in Jean's face that I recognized. That quiet, stunned shame that comes not just from being betrayed, but from realizing people think you let it happen. I offered to help her file the initial fraud complaint and track down every financial document she still had. I met her twice a week at the library and made lists, scanned statements called banks. I worked past midnight most nights. 2 months in, Carol stopped by my desk one afternoon and dropped a manila folder onto it. "You missed a duplicate form," she said. I apologized, started to open it, but she didn't walk away. Then she added, "You're doing good work with Jean." It was the first nice thing she had said to me. I nodded, unsure what to say. When we finally submitted Jean's full case file, it was over 90 pages long. The state's elder abuse unit accepted it within 3 days. 6 weeks later, her grandson was charged with financial exploitation. Jean got her bank accounts reinstated and received a small settlement from the insurance company. The local newspaper ran a story on the case. My name was in the second paragraph. Teresa clipped it and taped it behind the El Rancho register. She didn't say a word. She just smiled when I noticed it and handed me a coffee to go. I was still washing dishes 5 nights a week. But something had changed. I wasn't invisible anymore. Not to them, not to myself. It was a Tuesday evening in late March when my phone rang. I was standing in the back alley behind El Rancho, the scent of fryer oil still clinging to my clothes, watching the last light disappear behind the rooftops. The screen showed an unfamiliar number from Portland. I almost let it go to voicemail like I had done so many times with numbers I didn't recognize. But something made me press answer. I didn't speak first. There was a pause on the other end. Then a voice I hadn't heard in 6 years, raw and hesitant. "Hi, Mom." I didn't say anything. I couldn't. My throat tightened so quickly it surprised me. Jason's voice cracked a little. I wasn't sure you'd pick up. I've tried before. Hung up a few times. Abigail asked me something last week. She wanted to know why you don't come around anymore." I leaned against the brick wall and closed my eyes. The silence stretched long between us. "Where are you?" I asked finally. "Still in Lakewood," he said. "Look, I don't want to do this over the phone. Would you meet me? There's a coffee place in Wilsonville, halfway. You pick the time." 2 days later, I sat at a small table near the window of a quiet cafe off I-5, cradling a paper cup of chamomile tea that had gone cold. Jason arrived exactly on time. He looked older, thinner around the jaw. His hair had more gray than I remembered. He paused in the doorway, scanned the room, and when his eyes landed on me, his shoulders tensed slightly before he made his way over. "Hi," he said again, like we hadn't spoken on the phone, like it was the only word he could trust himself to say. I nodded to the seat across from me. He sat down slowly. "You look good," he said. "Different. Stronger." I didn't respond to that. He took a folded envelope from his jacket and placed it on the table between us. "I found this a few weeks ago in one of Dad's old file boxes. I wasn't looking for it. I was helping Claire clean out the garage. It was sealed, labeled, 'Draft, do not file.' But I recognized his handwriting. I didn't touch it. I waited. It's a draft of his original will, the one before everything changed. It's dated 2 months before he hired that second attorney. And in it, everything matches the final version. Your name, the business protections, the allocations, the same exact structure." He looked up at me. His voice dropped lower. "He planned it that way. You didn't manipulate anything." I stared at the envelope. The edges were worn like it had been handled many times, maybe read over and over again before Jason built the courage to bring it here. "There's more," he said. I also found emails. Between Dad and Henry West, they talked about Marion, about how she might react, about how he didn't want you to be alone in the aftermath. He even mentioned the possibility of a video message. He said, quote, "Linda will need the truth on her side when I can't defend her myself." I finally reached forward and took the envelope. Jason leaned back in his chair, his eyes red. "I let someone else shape what I believed, and I let you suffer because of it." "You let me disappear," I said. He nodded slowly. "I know." I opened the envelope, unfolded the papers inside. The ink was faded in places, but the structure was there. My name, my role. Richard's intentions spelled out in his careful, no-nonsense tone. My throat tightened, but I kept my expression still. When I looked up again, Jason was watching me. "I'm sorry," he said. "I don't even know if that means anything at this point, but I am. I was so sure that I was right. That Dad would have told me everything if it were true. That you couldn't be trusted. Because that's what I kept hearing. Over and over. From Marion," he nodded again. "She kept saying the same things. Don't be fooled. Don't let her control the story. Don't be weak." I thought I was protecting something. Dad's name, the company, the family. But I wasn't protecting anything. I was just being cruel. The coffee shop had quieted around us. Outside the window, the clouds were low and soft. It smelled like rain. I folded the draft carefully and slid it back into the envelope. "You don't owe me an apology," I said. Jason's eyes widened a little. "You don't," I repeated. "But you do owe me the truth. That's all I've ever wanted." He nodded again, slower this time, like he finally understood the difference. We sat in silence for a while after that. Not awkward, not full of tension. Just quiet, a new kind of quiet. He pulled out his phone, glanced at it, then set it face down on the table. "Abigail still remembers you," he said. "She talks about your chicken and rice, about the stories you used to tell her in the backyard hammock. I think she thought you'd come back when things settled." I looked down at my hands. "Maybe it's time I saw her again," I said. Jason looked up, his expression soft. "She'd like that. So would I. I think." 3 weeks later, the front page of the Salem Tribune carried a headline I had to read twice before I believed it was real. Margaret Whitman, longtime partner at Whitman and Brooks Accounting, arrested in elder financial exploitation case totaling over $500,000. There was a grainy photo of her being led out of her office, her mouth tight, her eyes hidden behind large sunglasses. She wore a beige coat I remembered from family dinners. The article detailed how she had taken advantage of at least 9 elderly clients over 7 years, gradually siphoning money through false investment accounts and forged authorizations. One of the victims was a retired architect who had once played golf with Richard. I stared at the paper in my lap, sitting at the break room table in the legal center, surrounded by the buzz of fax machines and quiet conversations. No one else in the office knew yet that I was related to her. I hadn't spoken Margaret's name aloud in years. An hour later, Janine called me into her office. She closed the door gently behind me and handed me a slim folder. The AG's office forwarded this to us. There's a conflict of interest concern. You're listed as a potential character witness due to your previous connection with Mrs. Whitman. I nodded, already understanding. We'll need you to recuse yourself from anything related to the case. Officially, we'll have you shift to other client work for now. But the AG also requested you consider giving a statement at their upcoming Elder Justice Summit. They want someone with experience on both ends of this kind of case. I looked at her. She wasn't judging me. She wasn't suspicious. She just looked tired and maybe a little sad. "I'll speak," I said. "Thank you," she said. "And Linda, I'm sorry. This kind of betrayal hurts in ways most people can't imagine." I nodded once, then left the office and walked into the quiet file room. I stood between shelves of case folders and let the fluorescent lights hum around me. The press had already picked up the story. Articles ran in the Portland Chronicle, Eugene Register, even a short segment on local TV. Margaret was quoted once through her attorney denying the charges. But the records were clear. The money was traced. The signatures matched. The audits confirmed. There were no defenders this time, no one to stand up in church or at a podium and suggest she had simply made a mistake. No whispering that the victims were confused or exaggerating. Silence met her fall. The same silence she had once wielded like a knife against me. I received 2 calls from journalists that week. I let both go to voicemail. One morning, a young intern asked if I wanted to give a statement to the local radio station that had requested comment. I looked up from the housing complaint I was reviewing and shook my head. "There is work to do," I said simply. I kept showing up. 5 days a week. Same small desk. Same quiet rituals. Filing research intake calls, assisting clients who didn't have the language or the confidence to face the system alone. Most of them didn't know my history. They only knew I remembered their names, their court dates, the names of their children. The week of the summit, I received a formal invitation from the Oregon Department of Justice. A panel of speakers, 100 attendees. I was listed under survivor advocate and community liaison. I didn't know what I would say until I stood behind the microphone. I looked out at a room full of attorneys, social workers, volunteers, and family members. I thought about Richard, about Jean, about Natalie, about the women who came into our center with grocery bags full of unopened mail and bruises hidden under their sleeves. I didn't speak about Margaret, not by name, not even by implication. I spoke about patterns, about how trust can be weaponized when it hides behind respectability, about how predators don't always look like strangers. Sometimes they look like siblings, children, longtime friends. Sometimes they carry your family name. Afterward, a woman came up to me in tears and said she finally felt less ashamed about her own mother's story. A man asked how he could convince his aunt to seek help. A teenage girl asked for a pamphlet to give to her grandmother's caregiver. I walked back to the train station alone, the sky gray and low. I passed a newsstand with Margaret's face still on the cover of a weekly magazine. I didn't stop. I didn't need to. The work waited. It always did. And I still had more of it to do. The settlement came quietly. No courtroom drama, no reporters outside, no televised apology. Just a stack of papers, a notary, and a phone call from the estate lawyer confirming that the dispute over Richard's will had been resolved in mediation. Jason signed without argument. Marion never showed. The money arrived in 3 installments. It was a large sum, more than I needed, less than Richard had originally intended. I didn't feel much when it cleared. No vindication, no joy. Just a sense of completion. It felt like closing a drawer that had stayed open too long. I kept my apartment above the laundromat. I didn't move. I still worked part-time at the legal center, still volunteered on weekends. But I did one thing differently. I used a portion of the settlement to create the Salem Legal Equity Fund, a small nonprofit dedicated to helping older women and first-generation immigrants navigate legal systems stacked against them. We paid for document translations, transportation to hearings, even helped clients apply for citizenship and housing vouchers. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't big. But it was something permanent, something that couldn't be taken from me or rewritten by anyone else. The day we hung the sign in the window, a small ceremony was held. There were only 15 people, but I brought a plate of cookies and a pot of coffee anyway. A few of our regular clients stopped by to say thank you. One of the women brought her granddaughter. The child hugged me and told me I looked like her grandma. A few months later, Abigail applied for our summer internship program. She was 15 now, taller than me, with long legs and thoughtful eyes. She wrote a cover letter so sincere it made me cry. I interviewed her myself like I did with every applicant. "Why do you want to be here?" I asked. "Because I want to understand people," she said. "And because I know I almost lost my chance to know you." Well, I gave her a stack of intake forms and taught her how to double-check basic contract language. I watched her grow more confident each week. She asked questions, stayed late, and one afternoon gently corrected a mistake I made on a housing intake form. Jason picked her up from work sometimes. He waited in the parking lot, never asked to come inside. Once he brought me coffee and didn't say a word, just left it on the counter with my name spelled right on the cup. In early December, I received a letter from the Oregon Commission on Justice and Advocacy. I had been nominated for the Community Impact Recognition awarded annually to individuals who had contributed meaningfully to access to justice in the state. I didn't believe it at first. I reread the letter 4 times. The ceremony was held at the state capitol. There were speeches, photos, press. Abigail sat in the front row next to Jason. Claire came too. I wore a simple black dress and pinned my hair up the way Richard used to like. When they called my name, Jason stood before I did. He clapped harder than anyone else. As I walked up the steps to the stage, I thought about that first day I left the funeral. The chapel. The silence. The sting of betrayal that had wrapped itself around my ribs for years. I looked out at the crowd, at the young interns in the back, at Abigail's hopeful eyes. I accepted the plaque and adjusted the microphone. "I never planned to do this work," I said. "I never asked to. But life has a way of asking things from you when you least expect it. And sometimes it's not about winning or proving anyone wrong. It's just about not letting them stay wrong forever." The room was quiet. I'm not here today because I fought harder than anyone else. I'm here because someone believed in me even when they weren't around to say it out loud. I'm here because I refused to disappear. And because eventually the truth stopped whispering and started speaking for itself. I looked at Abigail. I didn't take revenge. I didn't burn anything down. I just made sure they couldn't keep rewriting my story. Afterward, I stood on the steps outside the Capitol as the wind picked up. Abigail came to stand beside me. She took my hand without saying anything. Jason stayed behind, giving us space. She leaned against my arm. "Are you happy now?" she asked. I looked up at the sky, breathed in the cold. "Yes, I think I am. So what happens next?" I smiled. "We keep going. We keep helping. We keep telling the truth. And if anyone ever tries to silence it again..." She squeezed my hand. "We don't let them." If you've ever been pushed out of someone's life by lies you couldn't defend yourself against, if you've ever stood in a room full of people who refused to hear you, just know this. Justice doesn't always come fast. But when it does, it arrives with the full weight of truth behind it. And that weight is enough to carry you home.